Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third virtual conversation in the Representation Matters program series, Who is American? The Story of Chinese Americans in the United States. This series is hosted by the George Washington Carver Museum and Cultural Center, a cultural institution dedicated to honoring African American heritage, arts, and culture in Arizona, and Arizona Humanities, the Arizona affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Since 1973, Arizona Humanities has supported public programs that promote understanding of the human experience with cultural, educational, and nonprofit organizations across Arizona. This program was funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Karen Leong, Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies and Asian Pacific American Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. And before I turn it over to Dr. Leong, for the best viewing option in this webinar, you'll want to view it in full screen mode. And you can do that by going to the top right-hand corner of your screen and maximizing that. If you have any questions for Dr. Leong during her talk, please use the Q&A function to post your questions. That function will be located at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. And during this talk, if you want to interact with each other or post comments, you can use a chat. And if Dr. Leong asks you questions, you can also use a chat to go ahead and type in your responses. Today's session will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on the Carver Museum website, carveraz.org. And we'll also include a link to that recording on the Arizona Humanities website. So with that being said, I will turn it over to Dr. Leong.
Thank you, Julianne. Really appreciate your inviting me to do this today. Before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that ASU is on the ancestral homelands of American Indian tribes that have inhabited and cared for this land for centuries, including the Akno-Otom and the Peepash peoples. I recognize and continually affirm the sovereignty of Native nations in this territory and beyond. My acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to hold ASU and my communities accountable to American Indian peoples and nations, and to actively work and to dismantle the ongoing legacies of Southern colonialism. So I had a long title, but I just sort of shortened it to Chinese Americans in US Civil Rights, because I think one of the things that's so interesting is that even many Asian Americans don't realize how much Asian Americans have contributed to civil rights and the development of civil rights in the United States. And I could have presented about all Asian Americans because all Asian Americans have been part of this effort and this process. But for the purposes of this short discussion today, I wanted to focus on Chinese Americans. But please know that that doesn't mean that other Asian Americans have not also contributed. And for that reason, I also just wanted to pause and say that our hearts are with the people in South Asia right now, and also with South Asian Americans whose families are so affected right now by the crisis. And hopefully we can all be supportive of those in our communities who are also going through other crises as well, because the pandemic has, if anything, taught us how interdependent we are and how much we all rely on each other. So speaking of Chinese Americans, I wanted to say that, again, this presentation and the research I draw upon within Asian American studies would not have been possible had it not been for the solidarity shown by the Third World Coalition that included the Asian American people in the Asian American movement, Black Power movement, La Raza, and Red Power movements, as well as American Indian movements. And so I just wanted to say that, again, these ongoing struggles for civil rights and recognition continue. And it's, again, something that I stand on the shoulders of others who have done this work. So when we talk about civil rights, I know that we like to believe, or we want to believe, that civil rights is just going to get better and better, that the United States will get more and more progressive or more and more equal and just, and that we will follow this sort of linear path of progress. And I think what history teaches us is really that that's not true at all, that there's ongoing struggle, it's an ongoing dynamic of local, state, and federal strategies by different stakeholders. And not only is it a dynamic process of different scales of government, civil rights are also based on ongoing challenges to laws and practices by different groups. So African Americans, we know, have been so key in the accomplishment of certain civil rights in the United States. And what I hope you learn today is how Chinese immigrants also were Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans were part of the fight for civil rights based on constitutional amendments enacted during Reconstruction after the Civil War. And so the fight for civil rights is not just the purview of any one group in the United States. It's an ongoing process of all of us working together to contest and to learn from other people's and other groups' strategies about how to better attain democracy, how to better attain justice for all, as we talk about in our Constitution. So one of the things we have to think about when we talk about civil rights is often that people assume that civil rights are attached to citizenship. And in the United States, we have two formal forms of US legal recognition of citizens. There's birthright citizenship. If you're born within the borders of the United States, you are granted US birthright citizenship, but individuals may renounce their citizenship. And also really important to note is that American Indians were not originally citizens of the United States, and they were forcibly, for some American Indians, some welcomed it, they became citizens in 1924 by an act of Congress. There's also naturalized citizenship, and this is when people who are not born in the United States may apply to become US citizens. And part of that means they must demonstrate their ability to be American, and what that means has changed over time. In 1790, the naturalization law granted citizenship to individuals who were not born in the United States if they were free, okay, they owned the fruits of their own labor, if they were white or European descent, and if they had been in residence for 2 years. This law was implicitly male. Females received citizenship at the time only through their fathers or through their husbands. After the Civil War during Reconstruction, the Naturalization Act was amended in 1870, and it extended citizenship to persons of African nativity and African descent. Now, really important to note here is that there are debates throughout the Congressional Digest of the radical Republicans really trying to achieve equality for everyone. You could see on the pages debates about Mongolians and Malays and Indians and whether they could become citizens as well. Their efforts were considered too radical by many of the politicians at the time and people, and Congress only ended up extending citizenship to persons of African descent or African Americans. However, this legal acknowledgement of citizenship still did not result in substantive citizenship. So we have formal citizenship, but we also have substantive citizenship, which means are people fully protected by the Constitution? Are their rights as citizens always acknowledged? And unfortunately, we all know that Reconstruction was not a complete success, that Jim and Jane Crow laws were put into place by states determined to maintain racial inequality. And this included literacy tests and poll taxes. Now, one important thing to note is that these were intended to disenfranchise Blacks, but it also disenfranchised white people who might not be literate or who might not be able to afford the poll taxes as well. And I think that's really important to note is that racism affects everyone, even if it's often mostly directed at certain people, and those people may bear the brunt of violence, and we can definitely see that in our history, but it also can disadvantage other people who think they're gaining through racism. What's really important to note for Chinese immigrants and their fights for civil rights is that so much relied on the 14th Amendment, which was one of the amendments passed during Reconstruction in 1868. And it has 3 parts: that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So there's birthright and naturalized citizenship, there's due process of law, and finally, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And that's really important. What we know is that historically this was meant to make sure that freed African Americans would enjoy citizenship. It's explicitly overturned the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. And that was when Justice Roger Taney said that all people of African descent, free or unfree, were not US citizens, which is pretty remarkable. And so this actual amendment applied the Bill of Rights to all states for the first time. Another important development in understanding how Chinese citizens became protected under the Constitution is the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. This was a treaty that the US wanted to find a way to support its missionaries and business people in having free movement throughout China to do their to achieve their goals. And in this treaty, the United States and China granted each other the most favored nation status, which meant that citizens of China in the United States would be protected under US laws and vice versa. This also was not just meant to be friendly to China. It really was about the need for cheap labor because there was major labor shortages at this time in the United States, and there was a desire to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. This treaty was when the Chinese government was persuaded under the conditions of this treaty that their citizens would be treated equally to allow the outmigration of Chinese citizens to the United States. And also it was supposed to allow access to public education for each other's citizens. But soon after, there was major backlash against the Chinese. This backlash, this anti-Chinese sentiment had already begun. It was anti-Asian sentiment, really, but the Chinese were among the earlier immigrants to come, although the Filipinos originally had come in the 1700s in Louisiana. And this was the result of several things. There was no longer a need for Chinese labor in the numbers that they were being recruited to come to the United States because the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. Furthermore, excuse me, there was a national economic depression in 1870. This led to, it was difficult to find employment. And oftentimes in times of economic recession, greater racism occurs, and it occurs against people that are seen as foreign and outsiders. And so the Chinese workers faced increasing nativism, and the anti-Chinese movement took on a national import for both the Democrats and the Republicans. And what we see is that one of the first attempts where Chinese go to the Supreme Court, the US Federal Supreme Court, is the case of 22 women. And this was to protest the 1874 California law, an act to prevent the kidnapping and importation of Mongolian, Chinese, and Japanese females for criminal or demoralizing purposes. And so I'm not sure how many of you have read the amazing journalistic coverage of the shootings in Atlanta, but if you have, you know that there's this long, or if you watched Dr. Karen Kuo, my colleague's talk from last week, you'll know that there's been a long history of sexualization of Asian women. And in this case, there were prostitutes from Asia, there were Chinese prostitutes, but there was this real assumption that most of the Chinese women were in fact lewd and debauched. And what's interesting about this law, just as with the naturalization law, is you see these juxtapositions of free, unfree, white, non-white, male, female. And here in the 1874 law, you see disabilities, chronic illnesses associated with criminality and prostitution and immorality. So the case of 22 women is that a number of Chinese women arrived at the San Francisco port. the port official just said, well, okay, I don't know how I'm going to determine. How do you determine if someone is really moral or not? And the US officials thought they could tell just by questioning them. Or in the case of this official, if they came with children, they must be moral. And if they came without children, they must be lewd and debauched. And so there were 22 Chinese women that were ordered, held, and detained, and to be deported back to China because they could not prove that they were not prostitutes. Two of these women, I'm sure these are not their names, all was used oftentimes just as a like Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. They were among these 22 women who were brought into court. And Ah Phuc really went directly to the state and said, hey, I'm married to a Chinese man in California. I just came back to reunite with him. So why are you deporting me? And the women in the court were making a ruckus. They were upset. They were talking in loud voices. Some of them screamed. And an interpreter said, they're questioning their detainment. I said, we have not killed anybody, stolen anything, or set fire to anything. Why are we being treated like criminals? This is really important. And I have to drink some water, excuse me. This is really important because they're questioning these laws. They're saying we should not be treated like this. They're claiming the rights, sort of this human rights speech, and what they're saying. And then Ah Phuc, another woman, took the case after the state courts said, no, you still have to be deported, to the federal courts. And they were allowed entry by the Federal Court of Appeal by 1876. And so again, we rarely hear from Chinese women in this time period. They were often assumed to be like enslaved, disempowered. And yet we see here, they were actively seeking their freedoms. They were actively asserting their right to be in California. But this also spurred, and this is where we come with that push and pull, right? That continued dynamic and struggle. So when the state legislation was overturned, then California Congressman Horace Page went to the federal level and passed the Page Act into law in 1875. It was almost word for word, very similar to the statute. And so this Page law prevented Asian women at the time, especially Chinese women, from entering the United States, again on the assumption that they were prostitutes. And this further motivated the Chinese Exclusion law in 1882 that was extended indefinitely until it was overturned in 1943. And these were both gendered, so Chinese women were explicitly not allowed in. Working class Chinese males were not allowed to enter. The only people who were able to enter freely were those who could prove that they were born in the United States because of birthright citizenship, but we'll see that actually challenged. But this brings us again to San Francisco, and San Francisco had a lot of really interesting and creative ordinances meant to restrict Chinese immigrants and Chinese Americans. And the Tape family is another example of an extraordinary woman. And I really love to highlight the extraordinary women because, again, they often are left out of the historical record. And Joseph and Mary Tape were affluent. They had wealth. They were Chinese Americans. They saw themselves as westernized. They identified as American. As you can see in this photo here, they're dressed in what was called Western dress. They were not, they were wearing Western hairstyles. And they went to enroll their daughter in an all-white public school, and they refused. They said, no, we have a rule that Chinese students are not allowed to enter. And the Tape family, said this is not going to do. They sued the San Francisco Board of Education. Again, notice that many of the recourse at the time was legal, okay? And they went to the California Superior Court, and they said, the Superior Court said, looking at, again, access to public education through the Burlingame Treaty, to deny a child born of Chinese parents in this state entrance to the public schools would be a violation of the law of the state and the Constitution of the United States. And this is also because this was a US-born child. So the school board appealed to the California Supreme Court, but at the same time, they were like, we're going to cover all our bases to keep Chinese out of the school. We will open up a Chinese-only school on the edge of Chinatown. And at that point, the Tapes decided to simply enroll their children into that as opposed to continuing to fight. But what I wanted to highlight is how the mother, Mary Tape, responded. She goes, you know, you're making all these excuses to leave my child out of the public schools. What right do you have to bar my child because she's of Chinese descent? I will let the world see what justice there is when it is governed by the race of prejudiced men. And I think this is the part that I just really love. I guess she is more of an American than a good many of you that is going to prevent her from being educated. What does that tell us? You can respond if you'd like. Someone has, oh, Crystal, do you have a question? Or not? Okay.
I'm not sure if they intentionally raised their hand or not.
Oh, okay. All right, sorry about that. I just saw the hand. I thought, oh, I better respond to that. So this is really interesting, is that what we see over and over again in the 19th century is that Chinese immigrants, along with others who are excluded from the protections of substantive citizenship, have a better sense of the Constitution, have a better sense of guaranteed rights and democracy than many Americans themselves. And we see that yet again. Oh, was there a question?
I just had a question for myself, if that's okay.
Sure.
About the letter, where I saw that it looked like it was published perhaps in a newspaper, and I was just wondering about, like,
she wrote it publicly to, I'm sorry, you were just asking about
oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, she published it, she wrote it to them, but it was published in the Daily Alta, which was the Northern California newspaper at the time, to make sure other people got to read it as well. And remember, this is sort of unusual because she's literate as well and knows English.
Okay, I guess, yeah, I'm just interested that newspapers at this time are publishing letters, you know, from Chinese immigrants. And I think that's really interesting. Thank you.
And it is really interesting because I think what's important to note is that not all white Americans were anti-Chinese, or they might have been anti-Chinese in some ways. We know some missionaries supported the Chinese as long as they thought they were moral. So there's still diversity among European Americans as well as among any other group. So that's a good point. Thank you. So Yick-Wo Hopkins in 1886 was the first case to apply the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to protect the rights of non-citizens. Now remember, this is because of the Burlingame Treaty. It's also because of that most favored nation status. And it was all about wooden buildings in which laundries were housed. And because they caused fires, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors said, we will not allow laundries to exist in wooden buildings because they're a fire hazard unless you have approval from us and you get a permit to lawfully operate. But every Chinese-owned laundry in a wooden building was denied a permit. And now the owner was listed by the Sheriff Hopkins, San Francisco Sheriff Hopkins, as Yick-Wo, assuming that he had the same name as his laundry, but it was actually Lee Yick. And Lee Yick was arrested, put in jail, and he refused to pay that $10 fine because he said, this is absolutely unfair. And he immediately hired a lawyer to appeal his arrest to the California Supreme Court. And while the California Supreme Court said, well, you know, fire danger is a reality, and this is reasonable. We think this is a reasonable thing, and you violated the permit. But then he went further with another laundry owner, Wo Lee, to the US Supreme Court. And this decision, the Supreme Court level, was really important. The unequal enforcement of a seemingly neutral law violates the Equal Protections Clause. And they did this based on statistics. So statistics are good for some things, and often they're useful for policy. And there were statistics about the number of laundries that were in wooden buildings. There are 310, 240 were owned by Chinese. And yet The only ordinance was against the wood laundries because of the fires to heat up the water for the laundries. But there were other businesses that used fire that were in wood buildings, but only the laundries were regulated. So that was red flag number one. 150 of laundry owners were arrested for operating without permits. But they also had evidence that the sheriff had not asked 80 of the white-owned laundries to show permits. And only, this is a mistake, all but one white-owned laundry was given a permit. And this is where the court said, hey, we're looking at these numbers, and this is clearly a racial enforcement. This is unequal application of law based on race. And what's so important about this decision is that it did not immediately necessarily protect civil rights, because 10 years later, Plessy versus Ferguson denies that separate accommodations are not equal, okay? But beginning in the 1950s, the court begins to cite the precedent of Yik Wo and even quoted the majority opinion in saying that the right to vote is a key to a free and democratic society, which is at the cornerstone of voting rights. Furthermore, it was used in the interracial marriage law, Loving versus Virginia, which ended anti-miscegenation laws at the federal level, even though Arizona did it a year earlier. It was applied in abortion rights, 1973 Roe v. Wade, and it was part of gay marriage in the 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges. So this laundry person, by refusing to simply go with the law and asserting the Constitution protects me, helped lay the groundwork for later decisions, including Brown v. Board of Education 1954, because at that point, the lawyers who were suing the Board of Education were able to show that these were not equal facilities at all. And that's when the court ruled that separate is not equal. And again, that goes back to this Chinese immigrant who was not even a Chinese citizen because he wasn't allowed to be. And he believed in the Constitution. And then there's Wong Kim Ark, and isn't this a cute picture of him? This is his certificate. When you left the United States, if you were born in the United States, you needed to have a certificate. And it had as a metal seal. I've seen my great-grandmother's. And it had your picture, and it said, yes, you were born in the United States, and that means you can freely enter and exit. However, the second time Wong Kim Ark tried to return into the United States, the US Customs official said, hey, wait a minute, there's Chinese exclusion laws in effect. You are not able to enter. Even if you were born on the United States, Chinese exclusion means you're not a citizen. The federal government also said, Chinese law grants citizenship by bloodline. He could easily be a Chinese citizen. So Wong Kim Ark went to the Supreme Court and they affirmed birthright citizenship for all persons. And they said, this is about all persons. This is not about all men. It's not about all women. It's about all persons who are born in the United States, therefore have birthright citizenship unless they denounce it. So this is regardless of race, regardless of whether the parents are US citizens or not, and regardless of Chinese exclusion laws. Why does that matter? Well, I'm not sure how many of you know this, but in 2012, Arizona Congress people, the people in the Arizona legislature tried to pass a bill that would create secondary citizenship of Arizona for anyone born to non-US citizen parents. They were trying to focus this on Mexican Americans born to Mexican parents. And they said, you'll have a separate certificate. You'll have a second state birth certificate if your parents are not documented as having visas to be in the United States. This is still ongoing. This is still one of the major points in which people are trying to take away rights of citizenship. And so this is why it's so important to be aware of what's happening. It's important, even though this was in this tiny little committee, it was voted out positively. It did not actually come to the floor for a vote because many things. But it's important to note how we must be vigilant, how we must protect these rights, because they're not just about us, they're about others as well. And so again, this is a case where now people who are born, even if their parents aren't citizens, are still going to enjoy US citizenship. So I want to bring this back into this idea of what is citizenship. And there are, again, the legal definitions, but there's also legal citizenship that doesn't have substantive rights or protections. And what is informal citizenship? Well, informal citizenship is the way in which it may not be legal. I mean, it might not be about actual citizenship in a piece of paper, but whether you actually belong. And Evelyn Nakano-Glenn pointed out that African Americans many times were reminded they did not belong. She remembered her own mother trying to take a school bus, but the school bus driver would stop well before the school and make all of the Asian people get out in Colorado and walk the rest of the way to school. These are different ways of showing whether one belongs that can be collective or individual. But Evelyn Nakano-Glenn also suggested that there's insurgent citizenship, which can be articulated, again, either collectively through legal challenges or individually in refusing a lack of recognition, refusing how people are trying to deny one's humanity by enacting political action. And I would say, and actually Evelyn Nakano-Glenn based her theorization of insurgent citizenship based on the dreamers who were born to non-US citizen parents, who grew up in the United States and who filled the streets, who led protests, who were active in fighting for what they knew was, this was their home. This is the only place they knew. And similarly, I would suggest that the Chinese that you've learned about today are also demonstrating insurgent citizenship. They and their lawyers, their mutual benevolent associations, knew the Constitution, knew the protections almost more than Americans did themselves. Another important event was the murder of Vincent Chin, and this is about collective mobilizing for recognition. Vincent Chin was beaten to death brutally by 2 out-of-work auto workers. This was at a time of a great trade imbalance with Japan, and people were very threatened by Japan. Vincent Chin was the son of a Chinese American veteran and his wife, who he brought back from China. And he was Chinese American, and they thought he was Japanese American. And they got in an altercation, and they chased him down and brutally beat him. And what's really hard is that when they went to court, the judge said this was understandable on the part of the 2 murderers. It was understandable that they would beat him to death. And they did not have to spend any time in jail, but only had to pay $3,000. And that outraged the Chinese American community in Detroit. And his mother, who had been looking forward to him, helping to take care of her, as is often the case with Chinese American families, said she really lost so much when he was killed. Now, Lily Chin is the person I'm focusing on here. She was a war bride. She came to the United States. She worked in manufacturing in a plant. She was not fluent in English. And yet when her son was killed, she took it upon herself to be active. She helped mobilize the Asian American community, not just Chinese Americans, but other people of Asian descent who said, hey, they were trying to hurt people of Japanese American descent. When is this going to end? And she became this unlikely activist. She traveled all over the United States, speaking to Asian American communities, speaking about justice. And she again believed in the justice system. And she not only had to fight the judge, but she also had to fight the legal establishment where lawyers were saying, we can't actually apply civil rights laws to Chinese Americans. There were several lawyers in Michigan, according to Helen Zia, who said, they really still only understood it as only a black and white racial formation in the United States. And therefore civil rights could only extend to people of African descent. And yet this case and the mobilization across the nation of Asian Americans expanded the purview of civil rights legislation. And that also means that they not only expanded based on they not only expanded the purview racially, they also expanded it to include questions of sexuality and disability. So that was an important contribution also that Lily Chin contributed. Sadly, she did win the civil case, but the two men hardly paid any of that because they couldn't, they were unemployed. And she ended up going back to China because she just did not feel she belonged in the United States. So these are the contributions that some Chinese Americans have made. There are many others that are in the court cases, but these are some of the highlights. And I think what's really important to note is that people who are not formal citizens still can understand the promises of US democracy. They still can participate in collective action to seek justice, and that Asian American history is US history. And this history of activism is really about asking, what are my rights? Why are they not being recognized? Or resisting against the ways that dominant cultures might try to make people feel like they don't belong. And so I just wanted to end the talk tonight by asking, who does the hard work of democracy? And I think it's evident if you look at our history that who really does the hard work of democracy are the people who are at its margins. They're at its margins because they are not fully seen as belonging. But when they fight and they say, yes, we do belong, when they fight and say, I am not going to give up that seat, then they are actually at the heart and at the center of US democracy. They remind us, because sometimes it's easy for US citizens to take things for granted, to forget about these struggles. But the people on the margins remind us what democracy is really about. They remind us what the Constitution can be and should be. And they don't take their civil rights for granted. And I would say that this is the lesson from this talk, hopefully, is that we cannot take voting rights for granted, especially now, but all the time, because there's this ongoing struggle, this ongoing contestation, that our participation is part of making sure democracy works. And it's not just for us as individuals, it's collectively for the people around us as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leong. That was a wonderful talk, and really, really enjoyed your message about the importance of voting. We do have a few questions. I want to get to Shannon's question in the chat. And she asked us earlier, I think this was in reference to the Tape family and the letter that was published. Where would a woman of Asian descent at that time learn where to read and write?
So this is really interesting. She was taken in by US missionaries as a young child, and they taught her how to read and write.
So we have a question from Karen in the Q&A. They say, I didn't know that courts would not try to violate Chin's civil rights at the second trial in spite of the Yik Wo versus Hopkins, which was hugely influential. Did Yik Wo not take into account racial discrimination of Chinese, or was the language written differently? Just curious.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't say that clearly. So they were reluctant. Many of the more dominant lawyers did not want to take it on because they did not believe it included it. But it was this young woman, again, a woman, by the way, a Chinese American woman who said, I'm willing to fight this case. And she took it to the courts, and she actually prevailed with the civil case. So they did do it, but it showed that there was these sort of like assumptions in practice that it wouldn't work. And so she proved them otherwise. Thanks for the question.
And we have a question from Brenda. Blacks and Asians have both fought to protect civil rights, but not always together. So why is there tension? Do stereotypes cloud the successes?
I believe so. I mean, we know that there's this long history of African Americans who have fought for the rights of Chinese immigrants. You know, Frederick Douglass, one of the most famous, speaking out about that. And I think there's multiple things happening. One is that the system, the structures of white supremacy try to pit groups, non-white groups against each other because it makes it so much easier to allow whiteness as a system to thrive. Now, note that whiteness as a system is an ideology. Not all white people participate in whiteness, but in order to not participate in whiteness, it takes a conscious effort to be anti-racist. That is also to say that many Chinese immigrants, especially those who don't know the history, who've come here really believing in meritocracy, and many immigrants do, not just people from Asia. They come and they think that they believe those stereotypes. Some of them travel, racism travels across borders, and US cultural imperialism helps with that effort when our popular culture can be racist. We've seen, like with the Rodney King uprisings, that people from Korea really were influenced by many of those cop shows that would often show African Americans as criminals and no other alternative representations. So that can also happen before immigrants even arrive in the US. So those stereotypes can be part of it, and representations can be part of it. The model minority myth was used. It's not a myth totally. There's a lot of debate now among Asian American scholars about whether it's a myth or not, because so many Asian Americans sort of buy into it, and they try to participate in whiteness, thinking that higher education, economic mobility will get them ahead. And that also, when there's certain ways in which, for example, this last year, when we had a former president who was totally connecting COVID-19 to Asian bodies, especially Chinese bodies, and to China, we can see that there's this antipathy towards China that's being circulated broadly by certain politicians. And that also can lead to people who are attacking Asian Americans, the elderly. In some cases, is it partly they're participating in whiteness as well? So it's very complicated. Did I answer that question enough for you? Because it's a great question.
Brenda has a follow-up question here. They say, I'm really disturbed and saddened by violence against Asian people now. What can we do to protect each other and value human life?
It's really hard because so many of these attacks have been random, but I think if it was much more openly condemned, much more openly called out as unacceptable, not just by the president, because not very many people are listening to the president anymore because our country is so divided, but by local leaders, that would be important. I think that there's ways now that in Oakland, where there's a large elderly Asian population, there have been people who have volunteered and organized patrols to walk anyone who's Asian American home and to make sure they're safe. So we've seen this amazing community mobilization in some of these areas. I think one of the other structural things we have to address is mental illness and the lack of care shown towards people who are marginalized in our society because of mental illness. It's often correlated with homelessness or chronic homelessness and chronic unemployment. And that speaks again to the lack of care extended to our most marginalized and our most vulnerable. And so sometimes we see that mental illness might be part of these attacks as well.
Thank you, Dr. Leong.
Let me also just say that many African-American organizations have spoken up in solidarity with Asian Americans, and that has been really welcome, and many of us are grateful for that. And at the same time, there are these very, there's some Asian American groups that are very conservative, who believe they are part of the American dream, who don't want to look at their structural advantages perhaps. And they also have participated in anti-Blackness. And so I think it means more talking, more developing relationships of trust, and really getting to know, building this not just between Blacks and Asians, but with Latinx, with American Indians, and understanding that our differences are not the same, but we are all differentially affected by these structures. And so are white people as well. And Heather McGee's made that really important point that, we need to make sure that all the people who are affected, understand how ending racism can benefit everyone, not just people of color.
Thank you, Dr. Leong. That was such a great answer. We have a question from Rena, who again is talking about that Tate family letter. When Tate published the article in the paper, do you know what the reaction was from the readers?
She was very affluent and had many advantages that most other Chinese did not have at the time. So her family became even like an object of curiosity because she became a photographer. So oftentimes, and this was true of Chinese exclusion as well, Chinese exclusion did not exclude the wealthy people. It did not exclude diplomats, and it was a class advantage. And those people, many who were actually educated, eventually in the United States, like Mei Ling Sung Chang and her sisters, they were, educated in Georgia. They were looked on with curiosity, but not so negatively, even though there were still these really like dragon lady stereotypes that were attached to them. They still had more access and ability to navigate than the working class Chinese.
Great, thank you. And Brenda also says, thank you so much for such an insightful and timely presentation. It gives me hope.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your leadership as well.
And we have a question from HLT. Thank you for this very informative talk in Asian Americans' contributions to the opening up of the political system in the US. What do you make of the boldness with which some of the racist attacks on the AAPI people, the physical assaults of elderly women in broad daylight in the public places?
I think it really is this ongoing virulent dehumanization. So whereas we have the police brutality against brown and Black bodies, and they're not seen as, they're already experienced social death. It's interesting that right now, for a long time, Asian Americans have not, certain Asian Americans who are in precarious positions, for example, those who might be trafficked, those who might be forced to work in garment factories, like in the Almonte case, they're not seen as, they're not going to be legible to the state. But what we're seeing now is that these blatant open attacks really speak to the strong discourse of disposability, of this idea, it's a cliche, but it's true that many Asians, especially right now, where 66% at least are foreign born, are not seen as American. They are not seen as belonging. There's this idea that, people have when you look at the words that are said to some of these people during these attacks, they're like, go home, why are you here? There's this idea that they do not belong. And there's this idea that violence is sanctioned. And I think that is the problem, is that we have had so much and continuing ideas that violence is sanctioned. We see that in Arizona, I think it was 2 days ago, that the voting recount people said that China smuggled 40,000 ballots and stuffed them in the boxes in Arizona. And we can tell because the paper might have bamboo fibers in them. And that's like, that is an ongoing manifestation of the attacks that the past administration was making on China, because partly they're seen as this economic power, and they're seen as a threat to Americans also. So there's multiple moving pieces that are happening to make it seem as if violence is sanctioned against certain older, weaker, vulnerable Asian Americans, which is cowardice, by the way. It's cowardice. And I think that woman who beat up that guy who tried to stab her or hit her, he hit her in the face, and then she picked up that board, and she just, he was the one that got taken out in an ambulance. And I think that, that's a good thing, because I think that there's this assumption by bullies that they can get away with it when they're attacking vulnerable people. And that it doesn't, that happens across with bullies.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leong. And while we wait for more questions from the audience to come in, I did have a question about these attacks too. I mean, just from reading in the news, it seems like there's always a question about, is this considered a hate crime? Is it not? And I guess, can you talk a little bit about what rises to the level of a hate crime, I guess, in the legal system, and, what happens when things aren't considered hate crimes? What is that?
So hate crimes are really interesting because it suggests that a crime is more severe if it's committed with racial intent. But the difficulty, or with any intent like homophobia, anything under the protected categories, right? Sexuality, and race and so forth. But it's really hard to prove intent. So that is why it's so hard to prosecute these cases. And also that's why we see this real difficulty that hate crimes, identifying things as hate crimes, does make it stand out as somehow seen as more condemned by our laws. But if they can't really be prosecuted, if the standard of proof is so high, is it actually effective? And I think there are ongoing debates about this. And so I don't actually know. I go back and forth sometimes, because I think that sometimes, trying to kill someone is obviously a crime. And even if it's not justified by a particular racial identity, if you're trying to kill someone, it seems like it would be motivated by hate or extreme fear combined with hate. So I don't know. I go back and forth on it quite a bit.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions for Dr. Leong as we wrap up in the last few minutes? Because I have one kind of question that goes back to something you were talking about in your talk and with some of your responses is, talking about communities borrowing strategies from each other, in their social activisms. And then you talked a lot about these legal cases, which I know is something that all communities have sort of been a part of, but are there any other sort of strategies you see that are being kind of shared among different communities where they're borrowing from each other? And also kind of off that, like what is happening today? Like how are communities coming together, the African-American community, the Asian American community, and how do we bring these communities together today? Sorry, that was like three questions. So you can just pick one.
Okay. Well, I would think about Audra Simpson. She's a Native feminist who wrote about Mohawk interruptus. And she points out that the state often assumes it has a right, the state imposes its sovereignty onto American Indians who have their own sovereignty. And she calls for to refuse that. And I think this idea of refusing the state schema, refusing the justice system in some ways, I mean, it's very hard because, of course, there's ways in which we must sometimes look to the justice system, but also refusing that in ways of saying, we can create our own communities, we can be self-sufficient. We saw that happening with the 99% movement. We saw that happening we see more and more African Americans who are disaffected by the fact that they aren't getting protected by the law. And I think that we need to think more expansively. We need to think about claiming democracy on our own terms, because right now the structure is so structured to maintain the status quo. Justice takes a long time. And it's meant, in some ways, it almost feels like it's meant to take a long time. And so if there's a way to think beyond the state structures, if there's a way to think beyond, we don't need our legitimacy from the state. We need our legitimacy in relationship with each other, to see each other and recognize each other as humans. What would that look like? How can we think beyond simply what we're given? You know, and so I think that's something that we might want to think about. And we might want to think again, how do we teach this history? How do we teach this history to inspire that imagination, to inspire ways to go beyond what we already know, which is so riddled with conflict. It's so riddled with violence. And surely there must be another way. So maybe we need to think more broadly and expansively about alternatives.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Leong. That was a great response to my 3 kind of disparate questions. Thank you so much. And then we have a couple more questions in the Q&A. We only have a couple minutes left, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I think Carl is asking about democracy issues in Hong Kong and civil rights in China as well. So a little outside of the US.
Well, what's happening in Hong Kong is devastating. And what we're seeing is that with China was not always this huge economic power. And yet, with the past several presidents, there's not been attempts. And that's because of our reliance on the economic trade. And so this is a question that we as the people of the United States must think about. How are we complicit in these human rights abuses? How are we allowing these relationships to continue without calling out the camps for the Uyghurs, without calling out how the Hong Kong activists are being imprisoned? And I think, you know, we need, again, to really think through, you know, right now, so many people want economic prosperity. And yes, that makes things comfortable, but are we comfortable enough with people who are being disappeared in the name of authoritarian government? And that means we also have to be equally critical of our own government, because we also have a long history of violence. We have a long history of genocide with American Indians. And so I think that there's ways in which we really have to rethink what is our relationship with prosperity? What do we value as a nation? I think it would require a dramatic restructuring of our democracy to really embrace what we say we value.
Thank you so much. We're getting some heavy questions in the Q&A. Dr. Leong, do you have another minute to answer a few more questions? And we have another one from Rena. They say, it was eye-opening for me to understand how Chinese Americans laid the groundwork for civil rights. But why is Asian American contribution so invisible, and what can we do to change that?
I think we could just keep talking about it. I think we can, again, not in a competitive way of comparing ourselves against other groups, but saying, hey, this is something that, I think we need to educate our own community. Let me just say that. I think we need to educate our own community that has no idea about any of this, has no idea about this long history of civil rights. Not all of them, I'm not trying to generalize, but there's a strong number who really don't get it. And they're taking for granted the rights and privileges they enjoy because of the sacrifices of many different groups throughout our history. So I think that that's really important. How do we reach people who are not going to be going to school, but come in with these preconceived ideas? How do we make, and I think what happened this summer with George Floyd, I think that combined with the COVID anti-Asian violence, I think that has started to make inroads. And when I talk to my students, they talk about their parents and how they're talking about it and how they need to educate themselves and how they need to be part of Black Lives Matter. And I think sometimes there's this convergence of horrible things, but good things can come out of it. And maybe that's something, but it's not going to happen unless we're all committed and we all do the work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leong. Again, I think we have one last question that we can get to in the Q&A from Carrie. They're talking about how a lot of counties and states are trying to pass legislation to outlaw critical race theory in the classroom. So what kind of impact will that have, and what does that mean for teaching?
It's censorship, it's a lack of academic freedom, and it's in trying to impose white supremacy, because not questioning how our society is set up is enabling the status quo to continue. There's this idea of traditional civics. Well, traditional civics, as Neil Cattell said in the Frank lecture that SST sponsored a month or so ago, said, it's really important that people understand how civics is supposed to work. Yes, it is. But it's also important to take into account how the critiques of people of color, of feminists, of people who live with disabilities, it's important for us to take into account how those critiques have also strengthened our democracy and expanded it. And so I think that we need to think about democracy as a process, as an ongoing process, a participatory process. And we also have to think about what are the ways in which people are trying to control what is being taught. And when people try to control critical thought, it's never gonna go away. These ideas are out there. These ideas were here before critical race theory was even called critical race theory. Ida B. Wells, Anna Julia Cooper, Ah Fook, all these people are part of enacting this critique of our systems. So it's not gonna go away, it's gonna continue, but we should fight to be able to teach it. We should fight for the right for students, because when we teach it, students are really often excited to learn. And this is also white students. They're excited to know what has been withheld from them. And so I think we need to believe in that process, believe that what we have to teach matters, and just figure out how we can convey it in a way that will connect with different people who are willing and open to learning.
Thank you so much, Dr. Leong, for that really thoughtful response and a wonderful presentation about Chinese Americans in the US, but also, other communities as well. And we did get a lot of really great comments in the chat and the Q&A thanking you. So again, thank you so much for taking time, as well as, going a few minutes past the hour. And thank you too to our audience for tuning in tonight on this really important topic. I want to make a quick plug for our upcoming events in the Representation Matters series. We're going to be turning more to looking at voting, which is something Dr. Leong kind of left us off with, but we'll be talking about voting rights, the voting process. Next week, we'll be hearing from Dr. Joshua Sellers from ASU Law School, who'll be talking about voting rights. And we'll also have Adrian Fontes, the former Maricopa County Recorder, talking about the voting process. And we'll have Daniel Allen also talking about how to be an engaged citizen in the digital world. And more information about that will be coming out from us. So definitely take a look at our website too. We'll be updating that with our upcoming events. When I close this webinar, you'll be prompted to answer a very quick survey about our program. It's just 4 multiple choice questions. It should take about 20 seconds. So I'd appreciate it if you could take some time to complete that survey. And again, thank you so much for attending tonight. And that concludes our event.